I'm John Spears with the AG Tactical. This is Combat Lifesaver. Combat Lifesaver is an introduction to the principles of tactical combat casualty care. It is training designed to give the military and law enforcement operator the skills they need to identify and treat life-threatening injuries in the battlefield environment while allowing them to maintain their primary role as an operator. This is a video. It is no substitute for live training. It can identify deficiencies in your knowledge. It can expose you to new information and skills, but we're not turning you into a medic. Even people who attend our live Shoot House Combat Lifesaver courses are not turned into medics in 4 days. We give them the skills to be a combat lifesaver. This is not wilderness training or civilian first aid training. I'm not going to be teaching you how to take your rifle sling and turn it into a femoral traction splint. By the same token, I'm not going to be teaching you how to take coconuts and seawater and turn it into a nuclear reactor like the professor on Gilligan's Island. I don't say these things to make light of remote wilderness medicine training. Quite the opposite. That training is extremely important. This is Combat Lifesaver. If you're looking for that kind of training, seek out competent trainers. My friend and colleague Mike Griffin at Austere Provision specializes in this kind of training, but this is not what we're doing here. It's fair to say something about myself. My life in the U.S. Army Special Forces and my medical life started as an 18 Delta Special Operations Medical Sergeant. Years later, I went on and became a doctor and then further a surgeon. When I'm not working for EAG as a weapons and tactics instructor, I'm a full-time orthopedic spine surgeon. That being said, I want you to understand that nothing I am presenting to you has anything to do with my specific knowledge. Nothing that I am presenting to you is developed by me personally. I am very proud to tell you that I have never had an original idea in my life. If it is not in the peer-reviewed literature, if it does not meet the standard of evidence-based medicine, I don't know it. What I am presenting to you is an introduction to the doctrine of combat casualty care, and specifically the care under fire phase, what we teach to combat lifesavers. Whether it is somebody like myself who has the experience level of a surgeon, whether it's an 18 Delta or another special operations medical provider, or whether it's one of our tactical EMS brethren, the information that I am imparting to you is exactly the same because it is doctrine. The Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care has developed this information in the best example of evidence-based medicine available. Throughout the video, I am going to continue to drive you to go to the source. What I mean by that is on the World Wide Web, going to the health.mil library, under the Education and Training tab is a subsection on tactical combat casualty care. The updates from the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care appear there. All of the materials and teaching files necessary to familiarize yourself further with this material is contained there, and I suggest that you use that resource. The Tactical Combat Casualty Care doctrine developed out of Special Forces medicine starting in the late 1980s, and by the mid-1990s, it was codified into doctrine. After it left the special operations community, It made its way throughout the military and is currently accepted by the Advanced Trauma Life Support Committee as well as the Tactical EMS community. The Committee on TCCC and the SOCOM community developed this material because previous to that, a lot of our training was based on the civilian paradigm of combat casualty care. These concepts were in conflict. Why? In the civilian world, the mechanisms of trauma are completely different than what we see in a battlefield environment, where we're primarily concerned with ballistic and high-velocity missile injuries. As a result, our priorities of care and the type of treatment that we render has to be different. My culture is Army Special Operations. When I use verbiage throughout the video that is military-centric, you're just going to have to translate in your head. Even though I've been a law enforcement trainer with the AG for several years, I still lapse into what is my primary culture. I can assure you, however, whether the bullet is launched at you in the sandbox or on the streets of your own community, the bullet does not care. The TCCC doctrine that we are presenting to you is the doctrine that has been saving lives. Since the beginning of the global war on terror, and since this doctrine has been codified and accepted throughout the military, we have achieved a fantastic rate of survivable wounds. Less than 9% of all casualties die from their wounds, and a major part of what has made that happen is the TCCC doctrine. This video has been in planning for over a year. At the time of the filming of this video, we're just a few weeks status post the tragedy in Boston. This has been an all too real reminder of the reality of what constitute battlefield injuries and how we all have to be prepared to deal with them. This doctrine is helping that happen. Our goal and one of our primary missions is to help our law enforcement officials overcome some of this bad institutional inertia to let our law enforcement officers and first responders get the training that they need. It is very painful for us when we hear our students tell us that they're not allowed to carry tourniquets on their rigs because it appears too militaristic. Or when we hear that our sheriffs and our chiefs won't let our law enforcement officers get training in how to use a chest decompression needle because putting a needle into the chest of somebody who has a tension pneumothorax carries too much liability. This is a tragedy. And again, one of our primary missions is to fight this ignorance with correct knowledge and training. Do you hear me? Again, recent events have demonstrated the fallacy of a lot of this dogma and bad information, and we're doing the best that we can to fight it. Folks who show up to our classes want to get training in these techniques and this doctrine because they're not receiving it elsewhere. I try to always present the training that I wish I had received initially. It would have saved me a lot of heartache over the years. This is Combat Lifesaver. Let's start with an introduction into the actual principles of tactical combat casualty care, and specifically the phase of treatment that we call care under fire, or CUF. The skills within CUF is what we're trying to teach you to become a combat lifesaver. There's a lot of skill sets as operators and warriors that we need to maintain proficiency in. We all like to spend time with our weapons. We all like to learn and practice tactics. There's communication skill sets. There's breaching skill sets. There's SEER skill sets. There's fitness that we have to maintain. But whatever your breakdown of skill sets happens to be, in everybody's skill set at some level is some aspect of medical training. What's the value to this? The value is very simple. There are two bad situations. Number one, you're sick or injured and you don't know what to do to help yourself. Situation two, Your buddy is sick or injured, and you don't know what to do to save their life. Anybody who has been in either of these situations can tell you that number 2 is generally the worst situation to be in, because when you don't know what to do, you live with that for the rest of your life. It is an axiom of the human condition, and it is part of the truth of our existence, that at some point in your life, you are going to be sick or injured. When someone is sick or injured, they are at the lowest point of their existence. And if you've never been in that situation, I can promise you it is going to happen to you someday, where you are reliant on somebody else to help you because you cannot help yourself. The other value to this training that I want to make apparent to you, but I'm not going to talk a lot about, is this: studying anatomy and physiology makes us better at our job as operators, whether military or law enforcement. When you know how something is put together, you're better at breaking it. Here's a hint: Special Forces engineers don't spend a lot of time on bridge classification because they want to make better bridges. Do you understand my point? This is the value of any medical training to a warrior. Let's start with some basic definitions. What is a combat lifesaver? A combat lifesaver, for our purposes, is either a military or a law enforcement operator whose primary job is as a combatant. He is not a medical provider. His job is being behind the weapon and winning the fight. His job is not stopping what he does as an operator to provide medical treatment. He does not replace a medic. His primary mission is his combat mission. My definition of a combat lifesaver is simply this: a combat lifesaver is an operator who's been trained in the principles of tactical combat casualty care, and specifically care under fire. CLS teaches the basic skills necessary for you to provide life-saving aid in the battlefield environment. For medically trained personnel, CLS reorients skills that you already have to injuries that we see on the battlefield environment. The basic principle is this: the most important person involved in saving a life is the person who is there with the knowledge and the skills at the primary point of wounding. The person with those skills at that point is the person who's going to have the greatest chance of intervening and saving that life, not the person who can provide perfect medical treatment an hour after the fact. Here's a simple question: what do you think the best medicine is on the battlefield? I'll tell you what the best medicine is on the battlefield. This is the best medicine on the battlefield. This is what you use to save a life. The first step in any engagement where you have sustained a casualty is to make sure that you have achieved overwhelming fire superiority before you ever think about retrieving and treating that casualty. One of the differences between tactical medicine and civilian trauma medicine is, of course, the consideration of the tactical environment. Friends, good medicine is never going to be good tactics, and perfect tactics is never going to be perfect medicine. What we have to teach you is when it is appropriate to put on your hat as the combat lifesaver, and when it is most appropriate for you to stay in the fight. Do I make myself clear? I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to help demonstrate this point. I'm going to show you a series of slides. Many people have seen them because it's a very famous incident. Before I do that, I want to make this statement. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking. Anybody who thinks that I am criticizing or making any judgment about the actions that are about to be depicted, you are wrong. This is a learning opportunity. These pictures are going to help demonstrate why we first must achieve overwhelming fire superiority by use of our weapon systems and our superior tactics before we ever consider retrieving a casualty. Let's look at these images. The first image that you're looking at, 2004, Fallujah. What you're seeing is Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Shane leaving cover, running into the open street to retrieve a grievously wounded Marine. In this next image, what you see is their corpsman leaves cover as well to get out and assist Gunny Shane at retrieving this wounded Marine. What neither of them know is that this gentleman is unresponsive and he's taken a missile injury to the thigh that severed his femoral artery. As the two rescuers are attempting to move this wounded Marine to cover, they come under fire. Gunny Shane is struck several times around his ballistic armor. The corpsman as well sustains an injury as he has to abandon the casualties to seek cover himself. What's happened in this incident is we started with one casualty and we ended up with 3 casualties. What the rescuers weren't able to determine initially is that the wounded Marine had a non-survivable wound. He likely would have died of his injuries no matter how quickly they could have responded to him. Again, this is not a criticism of anyone's actions. This is simply a learning tool to help you in making decisions at the critical time. Years after the incident, Gunny Shane has shared his knowledge and what he's learned from this incident with the rest of the community. And he has said something that is very, very important for all of us. The number one thing that's going to interrupt your decision loop is not going to be contact with the enemy. It's going to be what happens when you start taking casualty. Our training has to reflect that the world does not stop spinning on its axis because we are taking casualty. The enemy has a vote and the fight continues, whether we want it to or not. So what's our task as combat lifesavers? Well, first we're going to discuss when it is appropriate for us to use our medical skills. Also, we need to realize we're not full medical providers. What we want to learn and what we want to be prepared for is the primary kinds of injuries that are likely to produce death on the battlefield, how we can recognize them, and just as importantly, how we can treat them effectively to save a life and stay in the fight. One of the basics that you have to understand is that 90% of all combat deaths occur from wounds that are not survivable. That means that even if I was there at the site of wounding with all of my skills and knowledge, I could not save the person. What we're trying to do is intervene in those wounds and injuries that we can modify so that that person does not die of their wounds. What we've seen is that for combat casualties who survive the initial wounding event, about 15% of the rest of that number go on to die of injuries that we could intervene in. And there are 3 primary groups of injuries that we can identify and treat to keep that person from dying of their wounds. Of that group, statistically, about 9% are people who die from exsanguination from an extremity from a major arterial injury. About 5% are those who die from a complication of an open chest wound that we call a tension pneumothorax. Finally, about 1% are those who die from some sort of airway problem. This is in contradistinction to our civilian trauma paradigm, where we most frequently see people die from injuries related to airway compromise. In the battlefield environment, airway compromise falls to the small percentage and the last of the major three injuries that we're trying to identify and treat. What are we trying to do? I have to give you a little bit of anatomy and physiology to help this make sense. The major thing that we are trying to do is prevent shock. What is shock? At its most basic definition, shock is inadequate tissue perfusion. What do I mean by that? Perfusion is the state where you take oxygen from your lungs, you push it into your bloodstream, your heart pumps that oxygenated blood to your brain and all of your tissues. That's the definition of life. So what injuries can produce shock on the battlefield? Number one, life-threatening hemorrhage, primarily from arterial injuries to the extremities. Number two, some kind of failure of ventilation or oxygenation because the person has a chest injury that keeps their lungs from pushing oxygen into the blood or keeps their heart from pumping that blood to the rest of the tissues. Or number three, some kind of airway compromise. When a person goes into shock, the body compensates. And these compensatory mechanisms and the understanding of those mechanisms helps us to recognize when somebody is in a state of shock. When you lose blood, your body wants to keep your brain and the other vital organs alive. So your nervous system works together to constrict the peripheral vessels in your extremities and shunt that blood to the core to keep your brain and your organs alive. When that happens, somebody's extremities become cool and clammy, what we call pallorous. If you've lost blood, your heart beats faster, increases your pulse rate in an attempt to keep blood flowing to your brain and the other vital organs. Your lungs make you breathe faster and increase your respiratory rate to try and push more oxygen into the blood. When you understand that somebody, when they're displaying difficulty breathing by increased respirations, that when somebody is demonstrating a higher pulse rate, when somebody is becoming cold and clammy, these are basic signs that their compensatory mechanisms are working, trying to prevent them from dying of shock. And it's recognizing the states that will cause shock and recognizing that when somebody is in that state, we have to raise our level of alertness and start looking for the injuries that are causing this shock and start intervening to save somebody's life. So how does this apply to what we're trying to do as combat lifesavers? We've identified the three primary groups of injuries that are going to kill somebody on the battlefield. So what do we want to learn to do? Number one, we want to learn to recognize and stop severe bleeding. Number two, we want to be aware of the potential for the development of this complication of an open chest wound called a tension pneumothorax, because the eye will only see what the mind knows. If you don't think about it, you won't recognize it and you won't be able to treat it. Recognizing a tension pneumothorax is the second largest group of injuries that we have to be prepared to identify and treat. Thirdly, we want to know how to restore and protect somebody's airway so that that doesn't kill them. These are the three primary groups of injuries that we want to recognize, intervene in, and succeed in to save somebody's life. Briefly, in tactical combat casualty care, there's three major phases of treatment. Number one is the care under fire phase. This is what we're going to be teaching you as combat lifesavers. Number two is what we call the tactical field care phase. This is a phase where now we've transitioned to a physical environment that's more permissible. We have cover, we have ballistic protection, and now we can put on that hat as a medical provider and we can start looking for, identifying, and treating these life-threatening injuries in a logical sequence. The third and final phase of tactical combat casualty care is tactical evacuation. For the purposes of this course, we're going to be focusing on care under fire. We're going to review verbatim the basic care plan for care under fire. First, return fire and take cover. Next, we're going to expect the casualty to remain engaged as a combatant if appropriate. Next, we're going to direct the casualty to move to cover and apply self-aid if he is able. Next, we're going to try and keep the casualty from sustaining additional wounds. Casualties should be extricated from burning vehicles or buildings and moved to places of relative safety. Do whatever is necessary to stop the burning process. Airway management is generally best deferred until the tactical field care phase when we are under cover. The primary thing we're going to do as combat lifesavers when we're under fire is we're going to stop life-threatening external hemorrhage if tactically feasible. If we can direct the casualty to control the hemorrhage by self-aid, by all means they should do so. We should use a Committee on TCCC recommended tourniquet for hemorrhage that is anatomically amenable to tourniquet application. That means an arterial injury to an extremity. We're going to apply the tourniquet proximal to the bleeding site over their uniform. We're going to tighten it, and then we are going to move the casualty to cover. This is the doctrine of TCCC for care under fire. These are the principles that you have to absorb and apply to be successful as a combat lifesaver.